Alegria de la Cruz has a history of creating spaces and moments for farm workers and other historically marginalized brown and black people to engage the powers that be, employers, judges, and policymakers. She does this with grace, impeccable logic, and a desire to be fair with all stakeholders. She and Michael reveal the story of her incredible journey from Delano, California, and the center of the United Farm Workers Leadership to Sonoma County, where she directs the Office of Equity at a turbulent time when grape growers and farm workers are deeply polarized. At every stop along her path, Alegria has sought to make more equity and justice for those who toil in the hardest of jobs of our culture, and to aid employers seeking the collaboration and stability of their skilled workforce. Enjoy the show.
Flipping the Table's history of podcasts has often been focused on the issue of food chain worker rights, health, and safety, particularly farm workers, without whom we could not enjoy such bounty. For the past 4 years, we've been working in Ventura on a project with agriculture and labor leaders to develop ways to protect field workers from heat, which is an increasingly dangerous threat. Field workers are in the sun and smoke during fire season. We expanded our farm worker heat protection work to Sonoma County in 2023, and this brought me back into relationship with the inspiring Alegria de la Cruz. This episode, we will cover the full story of Alegria's remarkable life and inspiring work. She has effectively used her unique upbringing to improve the lives of brown and black folk who occupy low-wage jobs that, among other things, feed us. I will not cite her bona fides because they will come out in our conversation. Instead, I want to share how she impacted me and Roots of Change through her powerful presence back in 2008 when she was a Roots of Change Fellow. Over the 3-year period from 2007 to 11, Roots of Change implemented 3 classes of fellows. Over the course of a year, we convened and hosted 5 or 6 2 to 3 day events for the fellows. Our goal was to knit a network of diverse stakeholders through dialogues around the issues and opportunities related to regional food systems, food chain workers, healthy food access, and building bridges to conventional agriculture. Alegria and 3 other Latinas were members of the second cohort of this program. So the first evening of the first weekend of this second cohort, and following a large dinner, we formed a circle. Our facilitator asked the fellows to share what they hoped for the coming days. One by one, they went around the circle, sharing a few minutes of thoughts or feelings. When we were about halfway through the group, one of the Latinas, a chef working to provide healthy food to her community, began to share. She had a lot on her mind and in her pained heart. Perhaps 4 minutes into her reflections, one of the white women in the group called out something like, "Can you just get over it?" A stunned silence ensued. The entire group, including the person who said it, seemed to be in a state of disbelief. I think all of us were asking, how could that level of disrespect actually have been said out loud? The moment was so mortifying, I cannot actually remember how we moved from it. What I do remember is Alegria, as the primary spokesperson, accompanied by her 3 Latina colleagues, approaching me and the facilitation team with a clear demand. The organization had to get its act together so we could appropriately handle the dynamics that come with diverse racial groups where issues of race, class, and power are central to the need for system transformation. She and her colleagues also sent a communication to our board's co-chair, Marisela Morales, a past guest on this program. Suffice it to say, that moment and Alegria and her crew's demand ignited years of work for Rock and myself. I actually have been grateful to Alegria ever since. With that, let's begin the conversation. Welcome, Alegria. Nice to have you here for this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So, always love to begin with an origin story. Like, tell us how you came to be here and who you are.
So I am the oldest of my parents' 4 children. I was born in Delano at the Agbayani village, which was a community that was created kind of with and for aging Filipino farm workers by the union.
The UFW.
The UFW.
United Farm Workers.
That's right. And I was born there in the farm worker clinic. My mom used to tell a great story about kind of being in the middle of campaigning when she was hugely pregnant and getting called down to a meeting in Delano and then kind of grounded in the Agbayani village, surrounded by, these really incredible, super militant, super organized Filipino brothers who really were the impetus that pushed the early United Farm Workers Union out into the first Delano grape strike in the early 60s. And because of anti-miscegenation laws and the difficulties of bringing their families from the Philippines to the United States, many of them were aging without family. And so the UFW created this community for them to live and to be cared for with their health needs. And that's where my mom spent the last few weeks of her pregnancy and the beginning of my life, is surrounded by, these incredible men who, in many ways, were just excited to witness the birth of a baby and, who had found their family in this movement. So that's how I came into this world, was
because both your parents were part of basically the expansion of the union, right? Really the development of the union.
Right. So my grandmother is one of the first women organizers in the early 60s and ran the first hiring hall out of her garage in Parlier, California.
Wow.
And my father had served in Vietnam, and when he came home from the war, pretty traumatized from the experiences, he saw his mom, he's the youngest of her children, just invigorated with a purpose and a fire that I think really motivated him into recognizing what it feels like to be part of a movement and how healing that can be for, traumatic experiences, to turn those into a sense of power and a sense of purpose. So he began organizing farm workers when he came home after having served in Vietnam, and he met my mom, who was, had dropped out of college as a young white, upper middle class student from Long Beach, and was politicized and inspired by, organizers traveling around college campuses at the time. And
anti-war movement and social movements, or anti-war movement?
Both anti-war and social movements. My mom was putting herself through college by working in the dining hall and learned how to speak Spanish, and went to a rally and saw, farm worker organizers in Cesar speaking, and thought, this is the time that I need to be, and this is what I need to be doing with my life. So left UC Irvine and spent the next basically 30 to 40 years of her life really dedicated to organizing and to serving underserved and underrepresented folks, immigrants, both as an organizer and then later as an educator.
Wow. I mean, you grew up in Delano, so you were at the headquarters. I mean, did you interact with others, that were part of the center of the union, and Cesar Chavez and others? Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't grow up in one place necessarily.
Oh, because you were campaigning.
Because we went on campaigns to campaigns to campaigns. So in the first about 10 years of my life, I think we moved about 15 times.
Wow.
Home base was La Paz, which was the UFW headquarters kind of in the late 70s, early 80s, that moved from Delano, which was relatively open and relatively unsafe, right? There were death threats, there were bomb threats, there was constant threat of violence against the farm workers movement and its key organizers. And so the union moved to 200 acres in the Tehachapi Mountains outside of Bakersfield, and La Paz, was the place that was home base for organizers and their families between campaigns. And so between my grandparents' home in Fresno and La Paz, so those are the two kind of key places that we would come home to. But we moved all up and down California, and to Houston, Texas, and Montreal, Canada, and finally to Boston, Massachusetts in 1986. After essentially the last, union martyr was Rene Lopez in 1983, who was shot in the head as an organizer for the UFW, organizing a dairy in Fresno County, and never any prosecution or even investigation of his death. And that was when union leaders decided that California was dangerous, essentially, for the movement and for continued organizing, and was causing such harm to people and to their families. So we moved all over the country and organized different cities, labor movements in support of UFW. It was a time when Duke Majan was governor and Reagan was president, and the hostility and the possibility of what could happen legislatively in California was very challenging. So grew up on the East Coast from the time that I was about 10 until I graduated from college. So really
Interesting.
a
Very
very
interesting.
wide mix of
Yeah,
experiences.
well, you saw a lot of places as a young person. And also probably hearing what your parents were dealing with must have really shaped a lot of what moves you today.
Absolutely. As a child, I think, you're trying to kind of float and get by. And part of always being the new kid and never really settling in one place for too long was also recognizing, the importance of continuing to move and continuing to adapt and to learn about new places and new things. And also learning that as soon as people understood what it was that we were doing in a certain community, there were reactions to it. I remember in middle school kind of getting grapes thrown at me in the dining hall after my dad came to speak at my school, right? And to give a talk and remember at a
People threw
sleepover.
grapes, because of the grape boycott at the time. Yeah,
absolutely, right? So, and I think there was, especially on the East Coast, there was, at least in, middle schoolers and high schoolers, not a whole lot of knowledge or understanding of what the United Farm Workers was and what the effort was. And so I've always recognized my responsibility to make sure that people understand, and that part of the work of culture change and movement work is education and continuing to bring along folks who have never necessarily thought about or seen or experienced or walked through the world with any of these considerations of folks in their imaginations and their realities.
Well, one of the things that I've always thought was admirable and important about who you are is that your family did really value education, and you got an amazing education, which kind of creates the ability to cross certain boundaries and represent in a different way. So why don't you talk about your education and how that has provided a platform for things?
So we moved to South Shore of Boston in 1986, and it was the first time that I'd really lived in a community where there wasn't a lot of Mexicanos. I remember it was difficult to buy tortillas in the grocery store, and when I heard Spanish being spoken around me, I was like, I didn't know Black people spoke Spanish, and oh my gosh, they speak Spanish so differently. The accent was so strong, Dominicanos and Boricuas, and it was the first time that I had really been around a much kind of more diverse group of Latinos. And when it was time for college, I had an amazing coach. Actually, I was an athlete in high school, and I had.
Yeah, did you play field hockey? What was it?
I played lacrosse.
Lacrosse, that's what it was.
I played the preppiest sport possible. Right. But I remember learning that it was a Native American sport, and really feeling that there was something about kind of reclaiming and creating space for my own indigeneity and reclaiming the sport and playing it. I always knew that it was my time to come out into the field when, the announcer up in the base would be like, number 17, and then just stop, right? Like, I don't know how to say this kid's name. And I would just step out on the field like, yep, that's me, Alegría de la Cruz. And not a lot of us playing lacrosse. But I had this amazing high school coach who was like, you're smart. You've got good grades. You test decently. And you're 2-time All-American high schooler. Like, let's go get you into Ivy League schools. And that option was not even identified by some of my college counselors because I was poor and because I was brown. And so they were looking at, state schools for me and where I could get a full ride. And I ended up at Yale University and got a very high quality education at the same time that I was organizing East Coast students in support of the grape boycott and making sure that our dining halls didn't serve grapes to students because of the ongoing challenges to farm worker health and safety around the kinds of pesticides that were being used and just other challenges. Spent a lot of time organizing around Prop 187 that had passed in California and just connecting East Coast elite institutions to the challenges of California and knowing that was where I was going home to at some point.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, you went to law school. When did you decide you wanted to become a lawyer?
So I remember being little and growing up in La Paz and having the privilege and the honor of, having people like Dolores Huerta and Chavez in my day-to-day as a child. And I remember Cesar would always ask, us littles, what are you going to do when you grow up? And it was kind of like an ongoing, I don't know, man, I'm 8, and he would say, well, tell me who you come from, right? Tell me who your grandparents are, Jesse and Arnold. ¿Y qué hacen? What do they do, right? Organizadores, campesinos, organizers and farm workers, and ¿y tus papases, right? Organizers. And Cesar would always say, like, the thing that happens after organizing is law, right? We have to make those victories real. We have to put them down in the books. We have to have people that are writing the laws that understand the way to write them so that they're real and that they really reflect the experiences of people in the field. You know that that's in your blood, it's in your history. And he always wanted me to be a judge. He was like, and then there's judges, and the judges are going to be the ones who decide the laws, right? And I haven't ever gotten there because there's something a little bit lonely about that, I think, for me. But there was a point in time when, it took me a little while to get to law school. After graduating from college, I spent about 2.5 years in Southeast Asia, first in Hanoi, Vietnam, doing international economic development work, and then for some time in Hong Kong, working at a white shoe Wall Street firm doing state-owned enterprise restructuring in China. But I do remember there was a point in time in Vietnam when I was out in the Central Highlands working on creating strategies for investment that recognize the importance of considering the environment and indigenous people and women's rights, and in ways in which international economic development really they'd missed that mark. It's a tough thing to kind of come in as a Western power with lots of money and hold some of these things over developing nations. And looking out into the rice paddies of the Central Highlands and seeing, brown bodies bent over, harvesting food, and knowing that I had a home to go to that needed me. And that
so
there was
it brought you
something-
back in a certain way.
Yes, it did, right? Brought me back into the Central Valley. So I left Southeast Asia and came home to law school at the University of California at Berkeley. And again, right, Prop 209 had passed in 1997, 98, 99. And so by the time I got to law school, all 3 years of the University of California at Berkeley had been admitted without affirmative action. And it was the whitest student body in decades. And there was a lot of just sadness and kind of grief around some of the efforts to unseat SP 1 and 2, which were the precursors to Prop 209. Prop 209 essentially banned the use of race in higher education and hiring and in contracting and procurement for the state of California. And the results were devastating to communities of color. And I remember thinking well, they let me in. We're going to be loud about this. And we're going to do our best to make sure that, the small numbers of us are not erased as a result of this marginalization and this, dynamic, which was intentional about kind of removing our right to a higher education. And so I spent 3 years in law school really reclaiming my education and knowing and learning that the education that I needed in order to be the kind of lawyer that my community needed to be wasn't necessarily going to be learned in the classroom. And so we spent 3 amazing years organizing with students across the country and recognizing the impact of the lack of affirmative action in higher education and what that did to our rights to be educated, right? To claim these spaces and to be in these spaces of higher education so that we could go back and learn and serve our communities. And my first year we were in Detroit at the district court, and second year at the circuit court, and third year at the Supreme Court on the Michigan cases.
Wow.
The Michigan affirmative action cases. And it was such a special case to be, an active student in, because it was the first time that students of color had been recognized by the courts as having a distinct right, a distinct interest in the litigation between white women who were challenging the affirmative action program at Michigan and the school, which said essentially, diversity is good for the education of students, right? Having a diverse population increases the quality of the education. If you unpack that a little bit, what that means is that having students of color or having a diverse student body is good for the education of white people. And so students of color at Michigan said, actually, our interest is in our right to be educated. It has nothing to do with our role in helping other people be better educated.
It's just all right.
Exactly. And so the court said, well, that is a different interest. And students of color were allowed to intervene, right? So there were the student of color interveners in the Michigan cases. And that's where we really saw.
Were you writing briefs?
We were writing briefs. We were organizing groups of students to come and hear the arguments and be able to kind of play with and challenge our ways of understanding what was happening in the law. So that was my legal education, right? That's where I learned not only about strategy, but civil rights law and what it took to bring the kinds of cases that were going to challenge, status quo and things that were harmful to our communities, and really excellent experiences in law school. And again, knowing that the education that we needed to create because it was not kind of there in quite the same ways. And again, recognize the intentionality and the exclusionary nature of some of the policies that had come down, and our responsibility to challenge those for generations to come.
Wow.
Because we were respecting the work of people who came before us as well, right? That was
What happened in the case? I don't remember.
There are slivers of affirmative action which have been upheld, and it really is on this diversity argument. I think, more and more there have been rollbacks in the affirmative action cases in Michigan. And there was a conversation around when it was being brought up at the Supreme Court, the Grutter and Gratz cases. There was a question like, well, at some point we're not going to need this. At some point it will be too far from the civil rights movement. Like that will have worked just by the passage of time. And I think when you look around at the outcomes, the data outcomes of students of color, in every stage of education, all of these outcomes are still negatively and disproportionately negative for students of color. And so we continue to kind of bump up against these challenges of institutions that are still using, ways of measuring our capacity that don't reflect lived experience and the experience of, again, right, recognizing that there were generations and generations of harmful policies that serve to exclude people, right? Like you can't buy a home here. You can't buy a home. You can't have a government loan to buy your home because you're Black, because you're Asian, because you're
You can't get
Mexican.
a government loan for your farm.
That's right. For your farm, exactly.
So this is interesting because in a way, I don't want to jump here. I want to nail some other points in that development. But what you're doing now is kind of close to this in a very interesting way.
Absolutely.
Because you were at that time focused on the right for education. But then you left that. I mean, you finished school, and then you came and you went to work for the California Rural Legal Assistance.
That's right. That was my first job in my summer of my first year. And I left with Jose Padilla, who was the last executive director of CRLA, that he spoiled me forever as a baby lawyer, because that was the place that was so clearly the right place for me to learn how to lawyer for my community.
And tell people what CRLA does.
CRLA, California Rural Legal Assistance, was an organization that was started in the early 1960s. It was a war on poverty organization, and it is about providing legal services to the rural poor. It's a federally funded legal service organization. So in many ways, there have been, again, you can see these rollbacks, right, in federal regulations. CRLA was prohibited from serving undocumented people, for example. CRLA has been prohibited from doing class action lawsuits. CRLA, until recently, was prohibited from claiming attorney's fees for its victories, right? The idea is that don't use public money to fine us and then make us pay you when we violate the law, right, from the kind of defense side. Sadly, the only right that CRLA has kind of gotten back from some of those restrictions is the right to claim attorney's fees. It's probably the one that I would want the least to continue fighting for low-wage workers in rural communities. But it's where I learned to represent farm workers, and where I learned about Indigenous farm workers as some of the newest migrants to our fields, and around the particular challenges of ongoing challenges with racism and discrimination in our own communities of color. Right. So I spent about 6 years at CRLA.
Just to give that a fine point so people understand, there are forms of oppression and racism between those Indigenous farm workers and Mexican farm workers. I mean, that does exist.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that exists very clearly and very strongly in Mexico, where you have mestizos, right? We have racism in our own community, where lighter skin and ability to speak Spanish, and diminishing people who are darker, who are smaller, who speak Indigenous languages. The word indio it's not one of respect in Mexico, right? And so all of those practices translate into the fields of California, where you have lighter skin, mestizo, Mexicanos, who have kind of risen up in the power structure. And because of ongoing discrimination in Mexico, Indigenous language speaking farm workers are closer to the bottom of the barrel in a lot of ways. And then I think that discrimination is multiplied inside of our institutions. So you might have a kid come into, a school system, last name is Ramirez, family is darker skinned, they say they're from Mexico, and a school system will think, oh, these are Mexicans, and speak to them in Spanish, when maybe those families do not speak Spanish, right? That they may be monolingual Indigenous language speaking. And so the marginalization that those communities and the invisibility of their own indigeneity can be hidden by the lack of knowledge, the the lack of people recognizing that this is a community that needs a different way of being served and seen in order to be respected and elevated.
Yeah, we've had some real experience with that down in Ventura, because there are a lot of indigenous farm workers down there, and some good organizations that are supporting them.
This Sonoma is seeing a real increase as well.
That's right. And it's one of the things we've really been focused on is indigenous language being used for warnings and other things to ensure that the indigenous workers know when it's too hot or when there's smoke. And it's not a written language. So we can't text them. It can't be a text. It has to be an audio warning.
I think one of the amazing things about different indigenous language speaking communities is also, yes, they may be insular, right, as a way of staying safe, but they're incredibly organized.
Yes.
And they're incredibly tight with each other. And so finding ways to break into feels too violent a phrase, but like to really connect with those communities is, recognizing leadership and leadership structures and the ability to really activate some of those networks that exist.
Yeah, it's really important. So a couple other places I'd like to go with you through your origin story, so to speak. After you left Sierra LA, didn't you go to ALRB?
Let's see, I
got appointed by Jerry Brown?
I spent a couple of years in an organization called the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. Which is a great organization.
We left the Central Valley because my 10-month-old son was diagnosed with asthma as a result of the poisoned air.
Yeah, right.
And I really learned, from a combination of farm worker communities and advocates who come before me and my pediatrician who was an activist for healthy air in the Central Valley around the environment and the way it impacts people's health, and in particular, the way it impacts low-income communities of color, and that is by design. And so I learned the importance of challenging some of those processes, right, using the California Environmental Quality Act and looking at the way we register pesticides and use pesticides and the way we enforce pesticide use. And so that was begun at Sierra LA, and then I really kind of saw the opportunity to elevate impact litigation skills at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. So I continued representing farm worker communities, just living in a community where my son could breathe, and did that for almost 3 years. And then there was a moment in time where I had a friend who had come into the inside of state government and called and said, Alegria, it's our time. There's a critical mass of us on the insides, and we've been fighting from the outside, right? I sued counties, I sued the state, I sued the feds. That's what I did. And she said, it's time to come in and be those people and stop creating the harm that requires us to constantly fight. And
so this was under Jerry Brown's first term, second, his third term or his fourth term?
It was his third term.
Third
so this
term.
was in kind of 2011.
Okay.
Put my name in the hat, and for consideration for a couple of different places in the Brown administration, and ultimately was called to serve in the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, which was a law that was signed into existence. My dad was translating the press conference that announced the passage of the law right before I was born, and
that was Jerry Brown's first term, probably.
1975.
Yeah. Both
my parents came when I was sworn in.
Oh, they must have been so proud.
It was very special, right?
Yeah.
It really felt like, I've talked about the ways in which my decisions about what it is that I do with my time and my education, and the ways in which I honor the people that I come from, right? That is my charge, is to make sure that I know and I lift up and I continue to honor the work of the people who came before me. And I remember my dad laughing, like this day. Like, I don't know that we ever thought that a farm worker kid was going to be working in the general counsel's office of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. Just really kind of like a little bit of glee, a lot of pride, and a lot of recognition that this is, these are some of those victories. That
I was going to say it's evolution. It's
claim.
like positive evolution of the system.
That's right.
Wow. And so what did you do there so people understand?
The ALRA, right, the act is one of the coolest pieces of law. It really is a representation of, powerful advocates and lawyers and workers looking at the National Labor Relations Act, right? Which, again, because of structural and institutional racism, excluded farm workers from the protections of the federal labor law, right? The right to organize is not recognized for farm workers and at the federal level. And so the
it was
state
left out of the 1930s laws that came
right.
out during the Great Depression. Just
so
people
farm
should
workers
understand it,
and
right?
home care workers
Right.
and, domestic workers. And you can guess what those kinds of workers have in common is that they are Black, brown, and Asian. And so California had an opportunity, right? There was a gap. There was a hole. And so you can respect preemption and step right into the gap. And that's what Jerry Brown and the farm workers and, really incredible thinkers did in that time, was to develop something that built on, the best parts of the National Labor Relations Act, and that also reflected the really unique nature of farm labor, right? Temporary and seasonal work, the importance of, things like 48-hour elections and, what happens when people are on strike and how quickly you have to move to do meaningful prosecution, because when the season is over, your witnesses are gone, right? And it was so beautiful to also lift up so much of what I learned, as a lawyer representing clients at CRLA, to move into being, a prosecutor for the state, right? For the public interest, for the state of California, as a member of the general counsel staff. So I was appointed as kind of supervising counsel, which meant that I was training all the new lawyers inside of the agency and bringing a different approach to the urgency. I think I remember meeting with Jerry Brown, with Governor Brown, and with the First Lady, and just hearing about the intent of this law was really different from where it is right now. And I'm looking back at this thing and I'm wondering, what do we do? And how do I make the promise of what it is that I signed into law in 1975 real in 2011? Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, you bring in people who know and who respect this workforce, right? This is a different kind of workforce. These are different workers, and you need to have cultural responsiveness, and you need to have a deep understanding of this community in order to do this job well. And I was really proud to say that's me, right? And so I came in and we expanded the agency, I think, fourfold in the first year of existence. The general counsel was the first Chicana who was appointed as the general counsel of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. And under her leadership, we were able to bring things that hadn't been brought in 30 years. So we had, for example, some of the first organizers, in the middle of an organizing drive who had been fired. Right? That has an enormous chilling effect on the campaign. And we brought temporary restraining orders to immediately replace those, to return those workers to the workplace and to show workers, you have a right to organize, right? And if this person is fired, that impacts your ability to choose, right? To exercise your right to make a choice about whether or not you want to be represented by a union. And so we won temporary restraining orders that hadn't been brought in 30 years. We brought first prosecution that lifted up the rights of women farm workers coming together to advocate for themselves against sexual harassment in the workplace as protected labor activity, right? Protected concerted activity. And I remember 3 a.m, nursing my baby and writing a brief, and I'm in the middle of, looking at a case and seeing, my mom's name in the middle of this decision. And she was the UFW organizer who, went on to a farm labor contractors onto the camp and said, these workers have a right to know that this election is happening. And the contractor's staff got into a fight with the organizers and kicked them out. And, her leadership on this case, resulted in California Supreme Court decision that said that labor rights that farm workers have extend to farm labor contractors. And so essentially they're,
they have
covered under the employer, under the grower who hires them. And so she, her leadership created this connection between employers and farm labor contractors. And, it's 3 a.m, and I'm reading my mom's name in this case. And I just remember thinking, this is such a beautiful way of honoring my mom's work. I also looked at the timeline. She was 6 months pregnant when this fight happened.
Oh, and you were doing the same thing?
Yeah.
You were nursing a baby?
And
wow.
And that was me in her belly when she was, standing up and creating this precedent that I was using, 40 years later in important litigation on behalf of farm workers in the state of California. And so, there's just super proud moments and things that I tell my kids about, and that I hope that kids understand that you walk through this world being proud of who your parents are, and it paves a path for you, right? And recognizing both the challenges the gifts that their challenges give you, right, to illuminate your path. And I just remember thinking like, yeah, this is it.
Very, very cool. That's a beautiful story. It actually raises lots of interesting thoughts for me around the conditions we're in now. But before we get to that, I want you to describe what brought you to, because you're now in Sonoma County, and you're now the director of the Office of Equity for the County of Sonoma, which is quite different than what you were doing at the ALRB. And so what was the transition there?
I had 2 little kids. I was working 120-hour weeks. And it was scary. Michael, my office was broken into multiple times. My windows were punched through. Somebody tried to grab my computer out of my office. My car windows were broken. I had, big white mayordomo trucks idling their engines in front of my home in Salinas day and night.
Just so people know what a mayordomo is, it's the manager of field crews.
And I was raised in that same level of threat. And I also knew that, with every movement, there's a moment where if it becomes personalized, if it becomes about an individual, right, you circle in and out, because it's never about any one person. And once you do the work inside of an institution to kind of lift up new ways of doing business, and you create protocols and you create systems and structures that create new pathways to doing business, then it's time to go. And that's okay. And so I think that there was a moment in time of recognizing okay, it's time for something new. At the time also, there was tension between the board and the general counsel and some of our really critical opportunities to take fast action that, again, reflect and honor farm labor, right? And the urgency that's required because of the time sensitivity of the work. We were having to go through and kind of get approval from the board side. That I didn't agree with some of those decisions. And
that points out the politics to me, because I think you can see it a lot in the world where the political powers want to make change. They make change, and then the resistance builds up, and then they back off to kind of lower the tension. And then when things kind of mellow out, then they'll move forward again. I've seen it over and over in the environmental movement, around pesticides, around certainly in labor. It's a dance. It's kind of a rhythm, a cadence that can be quite frustrating if you're on the side that wants to see the change. But it is also a reality. And learning how to work with it is the challenge that I'm really interested in. And I think it's kind of what's reconnected us really is that challenge.
That's right.
We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
So you came to Sonoma County. It sounds like it was a time to leave. You had done a lot. It was becoming more and more tense around personalities rather than the work.
Absolutely.
And you made a move here. Why Sonoma?
My husband and I were looking for a place where our kids could breathe. There was still a farm worker community. That's where I want to be. That's where my heart is planted. If I had my way, I would still be in Fresno somewhere, fighting a good fight. I really miss my home. But there's something about being home in a place where people are working the land and where the land is giving to people and where there's always work to be done to figure out how to honor those people and that land. And there was something that, Sonoma, I love the ocean. I was raised swimming in the ocean, and it was just a combination of things that really called us to this place. Sonoma is also a community in deep transition, right? We're still a majority white community. That changes in the next 10 years, right? And I was really recognizing the ways in which there was an opportunity to lift up leaders in the Latinx and indigenous language speaking communities and apply so much of what I had learned in Fresno and Salinas and places where that transition has happened, right? Those are majority people of color communities. And so there was something that called to me about the opportunity that Sonoma really represents still, right? So we know in the next 10 years, that demographic transition will mean that Sonoma looks like many other communities, especially agricultural communities in the state of California. And we are not seeing the resulting political representation in quite the same way in our bodies, in our governance bodies. And so came here as a lawyer in the county council's office, really saw the importance of being inside of institutions and of bringing particular perspectives, into decision-making, into processes, into consideration. And was enjoying also figuring out, like, how does local government work, right? I'd sued counties around CEQA, and here I am in the land use department figuring out, like, how are we actually considering alternatives and how to mitigate impacts on low-income communities of color, learning how to, create. And I was moving into transactional law, essentially moving out of litigation. My interview with the county council's office, I was kind of pushing a plaintiff side practice inside of the county council's office, and that doesn't exist yet. And so I remember people being like, oh, no, yeah, not quite. And so, but really was so lucky to work with, the county council who hired me. It was Bruce Goldstein, and just a justice warrior in his heart, and an immigration lawyer before he became a corporate lawyer, and then finally county council, and who worked to kind of create a practice that made sense for the kinds of things that I wanted to learn, and that would also mean that I was, serving client departments inside of the county of Sonoma. And so it was a real learning opportunity for me, and I loved it. And then about, 2 years in is when the Tubbs fire hit in 2017. So county lawyers play an important role inside of our emergency operations center. And
let me just say that the Tubbs fire in 2017 was probably the most traumatic event that I have seen on a community-wide scale.
That's right.
It was huge.
At the time, it was the nation's largest urban wildfire, right? This was a fire that was so powerful and so fast-moving that it jumped 6 lanes of freeway and devastated a tiny suburban
enclave
development,
of town,
right, of Coffey Park. And I was working late that night, and I remember going to sleep and thinking I was smelling smoke, and fell asleep anyway, and woke up at 3:30 in the morning and stepped outside because the smell of smoke was just greater than ever, and saw this orange glow in multiple directions, and was just like, what is happening?
Right.
So very quickly was activated by our county networks, and found myself with our county counsel, who was the only other lawyer at the time who was able to kind of get through the roads inside of our emergency operations center. And it was the first time that I'd actually set foot in our EOC. I remember telling my kids, like, don't worry, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be safe. I'm going to be in a bunker. I was thinking I was going to be underground somewhere. It was just a county office, right? Like, just not that far away from where the fire was burning.
Yeah, you could see it right in the hills right behind it. Right.
And it had hopped right across the freeway, just a little bit north of us.
Yep.
And a couple of hours into that effort, I'm doing what county lawyers do, and I'm suddenly realizing that I'm not hearing Spanish. I'm not hearing Spanish anywhere in the EOC. I'm not hearing anybody talking. I'm not hearing it. And so I remember going to the different folks inside of the EOC and saying, like, are we getting information out in other languages? And being told, like, oh. And then the question was, well, can you? And so I was like, absolutely, right? So I moved in that moment from being a county lawyer into being the county's first Spanish language public information officer inside of the EOC. And so, phone calls were being routed to my cell phone, and so I could, give people directions to where they could evacuate safely. And there was no information for people who didn't speak English, right? And I mean, there are so many ways in which that fire, you're right, has been documented to cause such trauma in our community, and how it's highlighted so many of the opportunities that exist for the ways in which we better serve every single member of our community, whether you're not mobile, whether you lack transportation, whether you're Spanish or Indigenous or other language speaking, elderly, hard of hearing, right? All of these ways in which people who can tend to kind of sit on the margins or be placed on the margins by institutions suddenly became so critical
Very
about the
vulnerable.
ways in which we were centering them and needing to make sure that we were serving them. And so
did that lead to the Office of Equity?
in many ways, for me, yes, right? And I think for our community as a whole, I think equity was really a word that started to be kind of bandied about across the country at the same time, right?
Yeah, well, George Floyd.
Well, and that was, 2.5 years later, 3 years later. But I think we were really also recognizing there was so much work that was happening with Sonoma County, recognizing for the first time for a lot of folks that they were a frontline climate change community,
right?
Like Houston, like New Orleans, right? With Katrina. Right. And I think it was really hard for people to make the jump from we are a bucolic tourist destination wine country to, oh my God, we are a frontline climate change community. Like there were melted remnants of, cars melted into the ground, right? There was the scars in our community. It was so visible. The impact and what, in many ways, what Mother Nature was asking us to do differently, what our communities needed us to do differently, and a lot of incredible data coming out, right? Katrina was starting to just generate so much data about the aftermath of what happens in communities when tens of thousands and hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funds come into a community, right? What we were learning is that actually, with every dollar of federal money that comes into a community, racial disparities increase.
Wow.
Right? That the way that federal money is structured and the exclusionary nature, that it doesn't go to people who are undocumented, that it's super hard to get paid for something. If you don't have anything, then it's really hard for you to prove that you've lost something, right? For people who didn't have leases for their trailers in a field, right? There was nothing to claim, right? For people who had multi-million-dollar homes in the hills that were, well insured at the time, you come out, data shows, and I'm not trying to diminish the harm and the trauma that people experience, but data shows that white people come out of disasters with that much federal money richer. And Black, brown, indigenous, Asian people come out poorer, right? And so you could really see the ways in which the kind of institutional and structural nature of disaster funding and disaster recovery was actually deepening the inequities in our community. And so that was the first time I remember really thinking deeply about kind of like equity inside of government structures and what our responsibility was to address those things. At the
I
same
just
time,
want to note that that's so interesting because it'll be 7 years this summer. So this is really a new thing because I see it in my world where it's only been the last few years the granting agencies within the state, California Department of Food and Ag, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Health, are now creating segments of the funding directed exactly to low-income communities because 7 years ago they did not do that.
Right. Well, and
it's all just emerging now. It's so new.
We saw, right, our fires came in the middle of the Trump administration and in the middle of the height of the fear and trauma that messaging and that approach to governance in our country was, it was horrifically traumatizing on undocumented community. 70% of folks who work in the fields, right, are undocumented. So we had huge swaths of our community not going to shelters during the fires, but fleeing to the beaches, to public parks, and kind of camping out. So not going to places where there was food and shelter and clothes and possibly resources, but basically saying, like, government, you scare me. You are the people who are likely to deport us. And you saw in the Trump administration a piece of news published by Breitbart saying that the cause of the Sonoma fires was an undocumented homeless man, right, who had started a fire. That was very quickly debunked as just false, fake news, right? But the impacts on undocumented people and their lack of access to FEMA resources. So during our fires, the Trump administration changed the little receipt that pops out after you've applied for FEMA resources that said, I give this information to the best of my knowledge, and I know that it will be shared with other federal agencies to connect me with other services. Well, during the Trump administration, during our fires, that was changed to say, including immigrations and customs enforcement.
Wow.
Right? It was very clearly directed at keeping people away from federal resources that were designed to keep them safe and healthy. Right? They were also being told, don't come near us because we'll deport you. Right? And that was a very clear message that was received by our population. And so the combination of all of those things was really, kind of, I think, creating an energy and creating, a path to something different, to a recognition that there was a hole that had been intentionally created, right, that our folks were falling through. And in this community, there was also a recognition that this is the economic driver in wine country, right?
Right.
Are these folks. And so, with the county council at the time and with a, coalition of folks really activating around immigrant rights, we started something called the Sonoma County Secure Families Collaborative, which provided kind of wraparound services, including immigration legal services. This is at the same time that the public charge rule has come down for the Trump administration. And so we saw immigrant families falling out of programs that are designed to keep them and their kids fed, for example, like, right? All these benefits
SNAP
programs, right?
Yeah.
We saw people not sending their kids to school, right? For fear. And so recognizing the importance of, kind of plugging those holes that have been, that have been created intentionally and seeing people fall through those.
The county decided to do something? Is that what you're saying?
So the County Board of Supervisors both, I think, convened the first group of people really talking about, like, what is our responsibility to plug these gaps and how can we fund immigration legal services, recognizing that our community has, we call ourselves the North Bay, but if you look into San Francisco and Oakland, the number of free immigration legal service attorneys dwarfs what we had at the time, right? And so we really saw the need to create and support low and pro bono immigration attorneys that, protect people against notarios, who are unlicensed immigration consultants who can actually cause more harm than good, and the importance of really connecting people to services that also recognize the unique nature of their status and the way that would possibly impact their pathways to citizenship later, right, as a result of some of these wrenches that the Trump administration was throwing in the middle of public benefits.
So I'm curious about this. As you said, the farm workers are essential for the wine country economy. The vineyard workers are the people that make it happen. And the wine industry is not just one thing. It's winery owners and it's management companies that manage the vineyards. So they're two different things. And then there are companies that just provide workers at certain times of the year. So it's a complex situation. It's not one thing. So were any members of that spectrum of the wine industry involved in these conversations and supportive of it at that time? Do you remember?
That's a really good question. I think that there was general support. I don't remember getting a lot of money from the wine industry to really kickstart the Secure Families Initiative. We continued to try to make the arguments around, like, supporting folks to be stable, right? Actually, Sonoma is interesting because there is certainly kind of seasonal fluctuations where you have like big numbers of folks who come in and harvest, but there is a population here that is stable, and vineyards require year-round, highly skilled workers, right? In order to make vines give, this is not low-skilled work.
Right.
This is very highly skilled work. To prune a vine, to make sure that it gives for generations to come, especially when we're talking about these old growth vines that Sonoma is so famous for, that is a highly skilled job, and this community certainly recognized that. And so we definitely have a population of farm workers who are year-round and who are stable, at the same time that we have these, huge numbers of fluctuations with H-2A workers and contracted workers from outside of our county who flow in for seasonal needs. I don't think that providing immigration legal services, there wasn't necessarily resistance, but I don't think that there was a ton of financial support.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. And I wasn't thinking about financial. I was thinking more politically, because it's in the best interest of the wine industry to have a healthy population of workers to maintain the vineyards, as you were describing. It's a skilled labor job.
That's right.
So when did the County Office of Equity begin? And when did you join that?
So pandemic happens in March 2020. And I think at that point, I'm kind of repurposed.
To deal with that.
Yeah. So I kind of went in to work for the Department of Health Services to hold some really deep community engagement, because what we were looking at in our community was, no different from many communities, but this huge racially disproportional, impact of COVID on Spanish speaking, on Indigenous language speaking, essential worker populations. And at the same time, we have, our public health department and our communications folks sending messages out like, stay home, stay safe.
Right.
Well, people who are listening to the radio who don't have the privilege of staying home and staying safe, who are going to work, listen to that and say, well, you're not saying anything that I need to know about, and would disconnect from the county because it was irrelevant to them, right? And so what we recognized was the need to really kind of knit back into the fabric of what it is that we did as a public service institution, to connect back to people and say, no, what we need to be pushing out to specific members of this population is, here are your rights, right? That will protect your health and safety and the health and safety of your family during this time, right? Here's how you ask for PPE. Here are your employer's responsibilities to provide you PPE. You have to be 6 feet away from a coworker. You have to be masked, right? These are responsibilities and these are your rights. And, there was a point in time where I would look at the data from COVID and just cry. 98% of the kids who were sick with COVID in our community were brown, right? And again, recognizing that's by design unless we design differently, right? And so recognizing there was an opportunity to design differently. And then it's May 2020, and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd are murdered in front of the eyes of our country. And so Santa Rosa, like so many other communities across the country, right? There were 3 weeks of helicopters around my little neighborhood.
Me too, right over my head.
Just, Black, brown youth, Native youth coming out and saying like, yeah, basta, enough. We have seen enough. Something has to change. And our supervisors met that challenge, right? They met the ask and the request for the community. And like many other jurisdictions at the time, created something called the Office of Equity. And in August, I was named, in August of 2020, named the interim director. And September, launched the office, and I was named as its founding director. First 6 months of our existence was really continue to support the health department and the, really powerful and transformational leadership of Barbie Robinson, a Black woman who was like, I know we don't have what we need inside of our department right now. I haven't asked for those, kind of voices to be elevated. Help me, right? Be my amplifier in community and in my department to help me bring those voices, that wisdom, those strategies, those places, right? Where do testing centers need to be? How can we get the word out to the right people and in the right places? What time do we need to have testing centers be open? What else needs to be at testing centers in order to make them relevant, right? I mean, basic stuff like please don't make people provide their government-issued IDs in order to get a test, because this is the same population that's undocumented. This is the same population that has been in many ways trained, right? That's having a very rational reaction to government and saying like, I don't want to go anywhere near you. Going near you keeps my family safe. And we're asking people to come to us to stay safe, right? And so what it takes to heal that distrust, that very rational, again, that rational reaction from people who have experienced harm, right, in their government. We're asking them to come back to us. That took healing. It took bringing people into the middle of our decision making, into the middle of our resource allocation, and it was not easy, and it did not feel good all the time. And
I remember guys like Zeke Guzman up in the North County working with communities, and there were a lot of people. So you were building networks of people that were intermediaries, promotores and others.
Exactly. Recognizing that, in many ways, our public health department was doing everything that it could, and imagine what was possible when you have like these incredible networks of these, promotores, people on the ground who were that first line, right? Of connection, of defense, of no, it's okay. Let me bring you into the testing center. I will also advocate for you when somebody who doesn't know the right protocol asks you for your ID, and I will remind that person, no, you're not supposed to do that. This person just needs a test, right? Don't do that. If there isn't translation at a center, if there's somebody who is discriminating against people who, we had calls coming in that in line as people are waiting for vaccines, right? People in line in our community telling other people, go back to Mexico, you don't deserve a vaccine, right? That level of intervention that's required for public servants to step in and learn how to do that work of interrupting racism that was deadly, right, to populations in our community. And so that was, the first 6 months of our existence is really kind of building out what does it look like to understand community as a value, community wisdom as a solution to a challenge that's staring you in the face with these black and white stats, right? And again, that's equity. Equity recognizes that the people who are closest to the challenges are the people who are closest to the solutions. They're typically furthest from the power and the authority and the resources to make those solutions happen. Yes. And so, we are the bridge.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me because it was a fire and then a pandemic, or a series of fires, 3 fires, and then a pandemic that really made it undeniable that we had to do things differently.
Do you remember the fire during the pandemic?
Yes, I remember the fire during the pandemic.
I'm staffing shelters, right?
Yeah.
And we had a group of 70-something H2A farm workers who called and said, we're evacuated from our housing, right? We're in the fire zone. And we're really scared to go to a shelter because this is our bubble. We know about the bubble, right? We don't want to break our bubble. We don't want to get sick. Also, we have 8 weeks of work. And if any of us get sick for those 8 weeks of work, why are we here, right? So can you help us figure out how to keep our bubble and come into shelter, right? Those are some of the questions that were coming from farm workers during a wildfire.
Yeah,
right?
that's intense. Yeah, and those are often isolated places where getting to and from is not easy. So, wow. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit because I want to talk about the challenge we face here in Sonoma County now. The challenge that I see is that there needs to be change, and there is a polarization currently between the farm worker advocates and farm workers and mostly the vineyard management companies. And the context is complex in the sense that what we're talking about, the fires, droughts, the increase in wages that have been legislated in the last few years that have improved wages, long deserved, for farm workers to get overtime. The minimum wage went up because for many years they did not have the minimum wage that other folks had. They have increased minimum wage and also overtime. So that impacted the wine industry because of increased costs at a time when wine sales are dropping. Then the concerns around smoke and risk have required the Ag Pass law, ordinance. I guess it's an ordinance in our county, right? Talk about what Ag Pass is and how this has caused a fight that's kind of broken down communication.
So Ag Pass was, an ad hoc kind of program that popped up actually for the first time in 2017 when our county implemented something that Napa had developed, right? So Napa was the source of fires, and Napa actually had experienced fires before we did. And the goal here was to figure out how to get workers inside of evacuation zones.
So they could do things that were needed in fields or on farms.
So that
dairies.
they could harvest wine grapes.
Yeah, but also dairies
Right.
and watering.
Dairies and water and keeping, livestock healthy and safe. Lots of different reasons.
Yeah, activities.
But the highest risk comes from harvest, right? And harvest is the thing that's most happening during fire season in Sonoma County, right? That's the nexus.
September, October are really the months,
That's right.
and that's when it burns.
And that's when you have thousands of workers, many of whom are not local, right? Many of whom are H-2A workers and contracted workers from out of county who may be unfamiliar.
H-2A workers, for the audience, are people that have basically a short-term visa to come in and harvest. It's a program that allows workers to come in from Mexico and other places with contractors who have to house them and feed them and pay them, but they're temporary, and then they go back home.
Mm-hmm. They work for one employer, right? It's not like a work authorization. It's a very, very kind of limited and specific function. And so the idea was working with our ag commissioner and our sheriff, law enforcement during emergencies kind of hold evacuation zone lines.
The gatekeepers.
And during wildfires, it's not just our own local law enforcement agencies. We have mutual aid that comes, and brings people from all over the regions and other states to help us in those situations. So you have a lot of folks who come from out of area, right? In our law enforcement, we're also holding the lines who may be unfamiliar with the geography of our county. And the goal was to figure out, is it safe enough, even if it's an evacuation zone, to have people in those spaces, in those zones? And some of the earlier kind of iterations of this program were to check and see if this is actually a valid, agricultural operation. And if it was, okay, you can go in to this specific zone and kind of get an okay from the person holding the line that it is relatively safe.
Safe enough.
Safe enough, right? And it's a little bit paradoxical because an evacuation zone, by definition, this is not a place that's safe for human beings to be.
Well, if it's smoke,
right,
that's harmful.
And really, during a wildfire, the reason why you want people to evacuate is that you want your emergency responders to be able to focus on fighting the fire, not saving people's lives, not getting them out of those areas. So you want the area to be clear of people so that you can fight the fire. And it's an interesting question in ag about relative safety of people inside of evacuation zones during wildfires for the actual kind of like fire. And then there's the resulting smoke, right? And I think anybody who's lived in this area during a wildfire just is immediately triggered.
All over the country, the
right,
East Coast last year because
exactly.
of Canada. I mean, everyone's
Just
seen
what
it.
it feels
I mean,
like to try to
it's
breathe and
incredible.
see. And
It's horrible.
do you remember that day? And I think it was in 2020 where we woke up and there was no sun. Felt like some weird post-apocalyptic YA movie. The day that the sun was, you know, the sky was orange all day long and it looked like the sun was setting. So, and we know now, again, after years of studying this, that the particulate matter in the air during wildfires is toxic, that it contains everything that's burning, including, you know, paint and chemicals and pesticides and plastic and, right? And fire is indiscriminate. And we know about some things that can mitigate some of that harm, right? N95 masks and limiting your exertion outside. And I can't imagine anything that requires more exertion than harvesting wine grapes, right? And how difficult that must be to do it in an N95 that's tight-fitting and going to protect you, right? The same time that you're being paid by piece rate, right? By the amount of grapes that you can harvest. That is what determines how much money you make, right? So all of those things are crashing into each other at the same time. And then also, this is our economic driver in many ways in this county. And then, can you make wine out of grapes that are smoke tainted?
You can't really. I've done it. That doesn't work.
How long can grapes be in smoke before
Yeah.
they are tainted, right?
Right.
How quickly do you need to get them off the vine so that they don't taste like, you know, paint thinner that has burned and attached itself to the skin, right? All of these things are crashing into each other at the same time and making it very difficult for our community to have a rational conversation that protects multiple interests at once, right?
Yeah.
I find, like, I remember, Michael, like, Roots of Change doing work on hand waiting, right? So I think it's another great example where you have really important worker protections instituted to stop the backbreaking labor of somebody with a short-handled hoe.
Yeah, that was CAF, Community Alliance for Farmers. Yeah,
right. And
right.
but Roots of Change kind of lifting up, like, ooh,
Right.
here's like an opportunity to create a new table for people to talk to each other. That
Right.
you know, you think that people are on the same side of things, and then all of a sudden, boom, it just kind of crumbling around you because interests suddenly diverge. Right? How do you have rational conversations when interests are diverging?
Yeah, it's interesting because there is common ground here, and you described it beautifully. The fact that the fires, with all their impacts, are hurting the grape growers, the wineries, the hotels, the tax base, and the farm workers. Everyone's being injured by it. And the question is, how do we equitably mitigate as much as we can or lessen the harm that these fires are going to bring? And it's actually not just the fires, it's climate change, because the droughts are the same thing. Remember when we had big droughts or floods, farm workers can't work in those times. They lose income. The wineries are in trouble because of these same impacts of climate change. So we share the common threat. The question is, how do we not eat each other alive trying to defend our interests? That's the challenge.
Right. Well, and I just, I go back to things that I learned. I served on the USDA California committee for quite some time. And, part of our role as a state committee is looking at insurance appeals. And I learned a ton about subsidized insurance coverage for growers and farmers, in the face of huge losses that are beyond their control. And it's not that to say that they have full coverage, but they are able to recoup some of those losses, right, through insurance that's highly subsidized, that makes it effective for them to be insured by the federal government. And I remember thinking, well, could we insure lost wages, right? So if we're insuring the loss of the vines, we also know that there's going to be loss of work if the vines are lost. How do we roll in to federally subsidized insurance the pain of those losses that reverberates deep into community, right? And that, again, there's a design of a program that creates a hole that who falls through that hole, right? Same folks who don't qualify for FEMA resources. Same folks who, don't have a lease for their trailer that burned up in a fire, that can't recoup anything for losses, right?
So why don't you talk about what Sonoma did there?
Right.
Were you part of that discussion that created the fund, the $3 million fund for lost wages? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think there's a big question in front of local government, right, in front of state government, which is, what is our approach here? Is it subsidizing loss, right, kind of creating essentially an extension of a public benefit program? Is it regulating, right, the payment of disaster pay or of hazard pay or of lost wages, and placing that responsibility on employers, right? Is it any combination of things? Is there a way that we create joint processes for growers and local government, state government, federal government alike to push into a fund? Our approach in Sonoma County was to recognize that there was this hole, right? And that our farm worker population was falling through that hole. And so our board allocated $2 million to disaster emergency financial assistance, again, recognizing that these are folks who don't qualify for any other form of help. And especially when there isn't a federal disaster declaration, like in the floods last year, right? That was an unmitigated disaster for so many people who hadn't worked in months, right? This is disastrous for their community, for their family health, for their safety, for their food, right? Power outages, schools are closed, people can't work. And there was no federal disaster declaration. So there was no individual assistance, even if, certain people did qualify for it. So we moved forward with something called recovery support centers to recognize that recovery happens day one of a disaster if you're doing it right. And created 2 kind of centers, one in Healdsburg and one in Guerneville, in the areas that were most impacted by the floods, and into the populations where you had the most number of workers who were impacted by not being able to go to work because their vineyards were flooded or because the roads were flooded, and pushed out about $600,000 in a couple of weeks. Board went back and pushed out another kind of $300,000 in different areas and to the wine grape growers to, kind of continue subsidizing. And there's still $1 million left of that fund. And what we've done is do a request for proposals and ask for community-based organizations to kind of be ready, right, to press play, so that we're not having to build something in an ad hoc way every time there's a disaster that happens, but to have a system in place that allows for the board to kind of push money into a fund that then will get distributed by community-based organizations who have trusted relationships with community members. So they're not showing up to something that feels like a government center with people in Department of Homeland Security jackets at the entrances, but they're coming to places where people are meeting them that they already know, that already serve them in many ways. Community-based organizations as that kind of trusted bridge between government resources and community members that, again, have a very rational reaction to avoid government when they're in distress. Mm-hmm. There's $1 million that has also been allocated by our board to figure out, what does it look like to continue institutionalizing these things, to not be ad hoc about it, to not have to recreate the wheel every time something happens? Does it look like also going to the state and the feds and saying, like, how are we solving this problem together? Local government, we will be in a place where we don't have general fund to spend on these things, to subsidize, right, to figure out how to keep people fed. How are we working with our state legislators to create, safety nets for all, including in disasters? How are we expanding unemployment insurance to cover undocumented workers, right? How are we being honest about who works in California and how we are recognizing their contributions and also their needs when they can't work? How are we building in requirements to pay hazard pay or subsidizing the payment of hazard pay to certain workers who our program is allowing to work inside an evacuation zone during a wildfire? So those are all questions that we are currently grappling with. Mm-hmm. And it has not been easy. It has been pretty messy.
Well, the industry probably feels that it's going to have to pay for it all. And there's probably fear around that, mm-hmm. and probably resentment, just from what I've heard, resentment around the fact that there has been this fund and there has been efforts to deal with problems, and they've increased wages and overtime and all that. So there's a fear. What I see with the wine industry is there's a fear of the increased costs and the profitability of the industry. What I'm hoping is that the industry will realize that by working with farm workers and advocates for farm workers, there's a way to, what you're talking about, elevate this conversation, because it needs to be covered, I think, by society as a whole. The industry can't do it alone. The farm workers can't obviously do it. The county government can't do it. It's going to have to be a partnership, I think, with state and federal government in the end. Mm-hmm. If we want agriculture to remain a viable sector of economies, we have to begin to share the cost, the burden of ensuring that farm workers can remain safe and healthy, because otherwise they're going to go to other industries eventually. As soon as they can, they will go to other industries.
And that's what we've seen.
That's what's happening.
There are not generations of farm workers. Right? Every farm worker kid knows their parents suffer and sacrifice so that they never have to work in the fields. That is the message of every farm worker child. Right? I did this so that you don't have to. I think all of us also remember being brought into the fields to work, to know what it is, so that you don't have to do it. And so
I know many people who are working in governments, working for legislators. I know legislators who came out of that world.
That's right.
And it's like, and they're the ones actually champions now who can help with this problem. And my hope is that the industry sees the opportunity.
There is such an opportunity. And I think what always makes me sad is when we're not able to recognize that change, yes, is scary, and that it's change. It's just going to be different. And how we move into change could be less painful
for everyone
if we're really working together. The level of pain that I've suffered as a result of being, a leader in this conversation, mm-hmm. It's been personal. I've been personally attacked. I've had my reputation besmirched at a state level. I remember my dad saying that you don't get that level of attention unless you're doing good work, mija. Mm-hmm. Adelante. But it is painful, and it doesn't have to be, right? And I think anybody who knows me, anybody who knows most anyone who is successful at advocating, is that you have to be able to be in conversation with people, right? You have to, Michael, the experience with Roots of Change taught me the importance of, continuing to stay open and recognizing that solutions have to be co-designed, mm-hmm. right? And that you have to consider and understand the interests at stake, and so that you're creating a solution that truly is solving challenges for every party. Otherwise, it's not a solution.
It won't work in the end. It'll fall apart.
Absolutely. And then I think to also just constantly, constantly, and without being tired of saying it, is that the people who least can hold those burdens need to be relieved of that. It is not just that the future of the agricultural industry in this county is on the backs of farm workers, right? Who are going to go work inside of an evacuation zone with no N95. That's not a just outcome. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to all say that together, mm-hmm. right? It's also not a just outcome that this sits just on an industry to solve by itself. But I think I really just want to underscore, we cannot place the burdens of this change on the people who can least hold them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think most reasonable people would agree with that we are a society, a culture. This country is great because we have done things that lift up, whether it's the education system, whatever. We have tried. There's a lot of problems in this world, but I think reasonable people can solve problems. There's lots of evidence of that happening. You're absolutely right. It can't be left to those with the least amount of resources and opportunities or access to power and influence. They just can't possibly fix it mm-hmm. by themselves. Mm-hmm. There has to be collaboration. And I think what you were saying earlier in the conversation about how the Office of Equity and the Board of Supervisors realized, or the Department of Public Health realized, you had to bring in the communities to actually design systems that would work, because trust, basically, community-based organizations are the trusted messengers, the trusted pathways. I'm just hoping that you and I could possibly get some conversations going with some people, reasonable folks who want the wine industry to continue, who realize the essential nature of the workers in that system and the needs of those workers. And we can work out a way to get past the challenge that AgPass brought up, the fight that came up around AgPass because of the wine industry saw it one way, the workers saw it another. They can't agree, and they're both unhappy with the way it turned out and what was said to each other. I think a lot of feelings got hurt. A lot of insults were felt, whether they were meant or not. It doesn't even matter. People felt that way.
I think the thing that stays with me the most about that last hearing is that Ag didn't show up. And
they didn't come?
They didn't come to the last hearing, and they got all of their needs met. Maybe not all of them, but they got what they had asked for.
Which
was a program that ensures that workers can harvest wine grapes during a wildfire. And I think that to me was such a missed opportunity, because those are the opportunities for conversation, and those are the opportunities for listening, right? And what we had was 20, 30, 40 farm workers and farm worker advocacy organizations pleading to be seen and to be understood and to be heard. And we didn't have Ag in the room. And that, to me, I think those are the opportunities where people really feel just confused about how these conversations are happening, because in the public, they're not happening. That was a public hearing. So I agree with you. This is about conversation. This is about relationship building. This is about being able to walk in somebody else's shoes, being able to hold feelings, being able to identify, you are afraid right now. I'm going to hold that for you. This is scary. Change is scary, right? Leading into a world that feels like a disaster is around every corner, and that you suddenly feel like untenable, foundation. Your foundations are shaken to the core. Like, yes, that is how people are feeling in this world. And to be able to hold space for those feelings and to then move into a conversation about change, right, is change management. In a way that is, emotionally intelligent and that is humanistic.
Yeah, and respectful, right? Yes, people have to be able to communicate in a way that doesn't increase the fear and the harm. So, yeah, well, we'll see what we can do, and maybe we'll have another conversation in a year from now and talk about if we made some progress.
I hope so. I have faith.
Yeah, I have faith too. I do. And I've seen it happen in Ventura County. A lot of good things have happened down there.
Yes.
We work with Farm Bureau very closely, and with the growers. We're doing some really cool things to protect farm workers from heat down there, working with actual farms and farming companies that are very thoughtful and want their industry to continue to be healthy. And it's quite exciting. And so I know it can be done. And I think Sonoma County is a place where it can be done. It just takes people of good spirit and forward thinking. So I want to thank you, Alegria, for an amazing journey. Your life has been really inspiring, and you are a true example of what you said about family, like what your grandparents did, what your parents did. Your father fought in Vietnam, your mother was an organizer, and then you've taken this other step to be inside government because of the work they did. And it'll be very curious to see what your kids end up doing. So anyway, yeah. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for listening. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.